Historians called it impossible habitation. Army officers who rode through the southern plains in January wrote home to their wives and said the same thing in different words. No white man could survive out here without walls. But the Comanche weren't white men, and they weren't surviving. They were living. -4 degrees F. Open plains. Wind that didn't bend around you, it went through you like it was looking for something inside your chest and wasn't satisfied until it found it. No brick, no mortar, no iron stove, no glass in the windows because there were no windows, no windows because there were no walls. Just hide, fire, knowledge so old it didn't have a written source. I know because I was there, not as a conqueror, not as a soldier. As a man who lost his horse, his provisions, and very nearly his mind 40 miles from the nearest settlement in the winter of 1873. They found me before I found them. And what happened in the days that followed, what I watched, what I was taught without being spoken to directly, what I understood only after I stopped trying to understand, changed the way I thought about cold, about warmth, about what a human being is actually capable of when they stop fighting nature and start reading it. I kept a log. I always keep a log. My father said it was a nervous habit. My trail boss called it a waste of good pencil. But that winter, on the Comanche winter camp on the edge of the Llano Estacado, my log was the only thing that kept me from disappearing entirely into what I was witnessing. This is what I wrote. This is what it meant. The first thing I wrote in my log that morning was not a sentence. It was a single word, pressed so hard into the paper that I nearly tore through. Alive. I underlined it, then I underlined it again. Then I closed the log, tucked it against my chest under what remained of my coat, and tried to remember how I had arrived at the interior of a structure I could not name, made of material I could not immediately identify, lying on a bedding arrangement I did not understand, surrounded by the slow, deep breathing of people who were not me. The answer, reconstructed over the following hours, was not flattering. My name is Elias Croft. I am, or was, at the time, a cattle drover working the high plains route out of a staging post near the Canadian River. I was 29 years old, employed by a man named Rutherford Oakes who believed in two things with equal fervor: the profit margin on longhorn beef, and the reliability of winter weather forecasts published in an almanac he carried in his left breast pocket like a second heart. The almanac had told him January 14th would be cold but passable. The almanac was wrong by approximately 40 degrees and an entire blizzard. Our outfit scattered in the whiteout. I went north when I should have gone south, or perhaps east. I still cannot say with certainty, because the compass needle was doing something during the storm that I can only describe as arguing with itself. My horse, a durable gray gelding I had named Sergeant for his persistence, went down in a ravine I didn't see until we were already in it. He didn't break a leg. He simply stopped and refused to move, and when I dismounted to examine him, I discovered that I also could not move particularly well, and that the wind had reached a velocity at which it was no longer possible to breathe while facing it. I made a small shelter from Sergeant's body heat and the overhang of the ravine bank. I lasted approximately 4 hours. I know I was found because I am writing this. I did not witness the finding. What I was told later, through a combination of hand signs, demonstration, and the patient translation work of a 12-year-old boy named, I will render it as best I can in English sounds toss-out, was that a group of 3 Comanche men had been moving along the ravine's upper edge for an entirely different purpose, had spotted the gray of Sergeant's coat against the white of the snow, and had come to investigate what they assumed was an abandoned or dead animal. They had not expected a drover frozen to the animal's neck. Tossout told me this story 3 days later when I had enough warmth in my hands to write again. He found my log interesting. He couldn't read it, the script meant nothing to him, but he touched the pencil marks with one finger and looked at me with an expression that I still think about. Not curiosity exactly, and not pity. Something more like recognition. As if the act of recording things, the physical insistence on this happened and I will mark it, was something he understood without needing an explanation. He kept a small bundle of his own. Not paper. Knotted cord, beaded in patterns I couldn't decode. He held it once while he watched me write, and I realized we were doing the same thing in different languages. But I am getting ahead of the log. Day 1, or what I designated Day 1, as it was the first day I had any control over my consciousness. I woke to firelight. This surprised me. Not the fire itself, but its proximity. It was perhaps 4 feet from my face, burning steadily in a central pit, and the smoke was rising in a clean column toward an opening at the top of the structure above me. The opening was small, perhaps 18 inches across, and through it I could see a strip of sky so cold and white it looked like cut bone. The structure was a tipi. I had seen tipis before, from a distance, from the backs of horses moving quickly in the other direction. I had not been inside one. I had not understood from the outside what the inside arrangement implied about the people who designed it. The fire was central. The bedding was arranged in a ring around it, so that everyone slept equidistant from the heat source. The liner, a second layer of hide that rose from the ground to about 5 feet up the interior wall, created a channel that I didn't understand until I watched it for a while. Cold air came in low, was warmed by the fire and rose toward the smoke hole, pulling fresh air in at the base in a slow, continuous cycle. The structure breathed. It was not a tent. It was a lung. The floor was not bare ground. 3 layers. First a thick mat of dry prairie grass. Then a layer of hide hair side down. Then a second hide hair side up, which is what I was lying on. My coat was still on my body, which told me they had warmed me without removing anything they didn't need to remove. My boots had been loosened but not taken off. My log was still against my chest. I lay still and watched. There were 7 people in the tipi. An older woman, I would later learn she was named something I'll write as Mayo, which Tossout told me was a reference to a kind of bird, though he disagreed with himself twice about which bird sat nearest the fire, doing something with her hands that I could not see clearly. 2 younger women slept on the far side. A man of perhaps 45, broad through the shoulders and with a calm face that never seemed to change expression regardless of what was happening around him. I began calling him Stoneface in the log, which was unfair and inaccurate, but I was working with limited information, sat near the door, not sleeping. He was awake, watching the entrance flap, doing nothing else. I would later understand that he was listening, not watching. The flap was nearly opaque, but the wind moving around the tipi had a sound, and he was reading that sound the way I read the almanac, except he was better at it, and his information was accurate. 2 children slept in a pile of fur near the older woman, and Tossout, though I didn't know his name yet, sat cross-legged beside me, awake, watching me the way you watch a fire, not because anything is happening but because something might and you want to be present for it. When I opened my eyes fully and turned my head, he nodded. Not hello, more like good you're back. I tried to speak. My throat produced a sound that was not a word. He reached behind him and produced a container, a kind of bladder sealed, and offered it to me. Warm liquid, not quite broth, not quite tea. Something in between that tasted of animal fat, and something herbal and bitter, and which spread through my chest with a warmth so immediate and specific that I made a noise I am not proud of. Tossout almost smiled. He looked away immediately, as if the politeness of the situation required pretending he hadn't seen it. I wrote in the log, alive, someone's tipi, boy maybe 12, warm drink, check fingers. Fingers were present, slightly wooden but present. I had kept them. It snowed for 2 more days. I know this because of the sky visible through the smoke hole and because Stoneface, whose actual name, rendered roughly, was Ekapi, meaning something to do with a stone's patience, which made my nickname for him both ironic and accidentally correct. Went outside twice each day to check conditions, returned without speaking, and resumed his position by the door. On the morning of the second day, I was well enough to sit up. This was apparently significant because Mayo looked at me for the first time, really looked, not the peripheral monitoring she'd been doing since I'd arrived, and said something in a tone that was clearly an assessment. Tossout translated, or tried to. His English was functional in a way that suggested it had been learned entirely through observation and selective trading post encounters, without formal instruction. He had large gaps where the English word simply didn't exist for him yet, and he would pause in those gaps, visibly frustrated, and tap the side of his head like he was trying to knock the word loose. What Mayo had said, according to Tossout, was roughly, "His body doesn't know how to keep itself warm. He's been fighting the cold instead of using it." I wrote that down. Doesn't know how to keep himself warm, fighting the cold instead of using it. I read it twice. I wanted to disagree. I had been surviving in cold weather my entire adult life. I wore layers, I built fires, I kept moving. Then I looked at what I had been lying on for 2 days, and what I was surrounded by, and I started to reconsider. The education began not as instruction, but as observation. I was not taught the way a student is taught. Nobody sat across from me and explained principles. What happened was more like, the daily life of the tipi continued around me, and I was simply present for it. And if I was paying attention, and I was, because I had nothing else to do and my log needed entries, I began to understand the architecture of warmth that governed every decision. The fire was never large. This was the first thing I noticed that contradicted everything I thought I knew. In my experience, cold meant big fire, more fuel, more heat, survival. But the fire in the tipi was carefully, almost frugally maintained. Not small enough to be insufficient, it produced consistent, steady heat, but never the roaring blaze I would have built. I asked Tossout why eventually. He thought for a long time, then pointed at the smoke hole, then at the liner, then at the people sleeping. "Big fire," he said, "burns the air." I didn't understand this immediately. He tried again. "Big fire," he mimicked, pulling air toward himself, then outward, "takes. The liner," he touched the hide wall, "holds." He looked at me to see if I was following. "Small fire, air stays, warmth stays, big fire, air goes up. Cold comes in faster." He was describing convection. He didn't have the word. He had the understanding, derived from generations of observed consequence, precise and accurate, and completely without the vocabulary I would have used to explain the same phenomenon in a school I had never attended. I wrote small fire by design, not poverty, engineering. Mayo watched me write this and said something brief. "Tossout," she says, "you are finally looking at things right." The second lesson came from the bedding, and it was delivered not by anyone speaking but by watching the children. The 2 children, a girl of perhaps 7 and a boy of 4 or 5, spent most of the day inside the tipi when the storm was at its peak. They were not idle. The girl was being taught something by Mayo involving sinew and a bone needle. I couldn't see the object they were working on, but the motions were deliberate, and the older woman corrected the girl's grip twice with the kind of patience that was not gentle so much as thorough. She would take the girl's hand, adjust the position of the fingers, then release without comment. The girl would try again. This happened for hours. The boy was doing something with 2 small pieces of hide and a stone, rolling the stone back and forth between the hides in a motion that seemed purposeless until I realized, watching him for about 20 minutes, that he was softening the hide. His small hands were working the material the way a baker works dough, and the motion was so practiced and automatic that he clearly wasn't thinking about it. He was watching the woman and girl, processing the needle lesson peripherally, while his hands did their work without supervision. They were contributing. A 4-year-old was contributing to the winter household's function without being asked, without being directed in that moment, because the contribution was simply what you did when you were inside, and it was cold outside. The labor had been absorbed into the category of existing so thoroughly that it didn't look like labor. I thought about the boys I knew back in the settlements. 4 years old meant sitting near a fire being fed by someone else. I wrote everyone works. Even the smallest, not cruelty integration. The cold is not fought, it's budgeted for. I underlined budgeted. My trail boss would have understood that word. The concept might have surprised him, applied to a people he thought of as living without forethought. On the third day, the snow stopped. Ekapi went outside and did not immediately return, which was different from his usual pattern. Mayo began a slow, organized process of preparing food, something with dried meat and a rendered fat that smelled like cedar and rendered game, cooked together in a process that produced a dense, caloric paste rather than anything resembling the meals I was used to. She portioned it with a precision that I recognized after a moment as the precision of someone who has calculated, not guessed. She knew exactly how much existed, and exactly how many mouths it needed to serve, and the portions reflected that arithmetic without waste. She gave me a portion, smaller than the others, which I initially read as dismissal or hierarchy. Then I realized I had been lying still for 3 days. My caloric expenditure was the lowest in the tipi. She had adjusted for it. I ate mine and felt, for the first time, genuinely warm from the inside, not just warm from the fire, not just insulated by the bedding, but warm from within, which is a different thing entirely, a warmth that moves rather than sits. Tossout came to sit beside me while I ate. He had his knotted cord, and he was adding to it a small stone bead, which he threaded onto the cord with the same practiced motions the girl had used with the needle. "What does it record?" I asked him. He looked at the cord. "Things that happened, things to remember, things that tell me who I came from." "Like a log." He considered this. "Your log tells you who you are," he said. "Mine tells me who we are." I wrote that down. I've thought about the distinction every winter since. Ekapi returned in the early afternoon. He brought 2 other men. I hadn't seen them before, and understood that there were other tipis, a full winter camp of perhaps 40 people spread along the sheltered side of a low ridge I hadn't been able to see from the ravine where I'd been found. The 3 men were carrying a killed deer, and the way they moved it into the space near the tipi for processing was so coordinated that it looked choreographed, but there had been no instruction exchanged that I could see. They knew their positions. They knew the sequence. They had done this enough times that their bodies knew it independent of thought. The processing was rapid and total. Nothing was discarded that could be used. The hide would become material. The sinew, separated carefully, would become thread and cordage. The stomach became a cooking vessel. The bones were cracked for marrow. The meat was divided in a proportion I couldn't calculate, but which, by the end, had been distributed across multiple households. With the largest cuts going to, I asked Tossout, the elders and the families with young children. Not the hunters who had killed it. I had grown up with the understanding that the man who killed the deer ate the best cut. It was the logic of the frontier. You earned what you took. But this was different arithmetic, and it wasn't charity. It was strategy. The children needed the caloric density to survive winter. The elders needed it because their bodies were less efficient at converting food to heat. The hunters who had made the kill were young, strong, efficient. They needed less, and they knew it, and they took less, and this was not sacrifice. It was the cold, clear logic of collective survival. I wrote, "The hunter gives the best cut away," not generosity, precision. Then I crossed out generosity and wrote it back in, because it was that too. The precision and the generosity weren't opposites. They had arrived at the same place from different directions. That evening, as the temperature dropped again, I could feel it in the way the tipi's interior took on a slightly different quality of air, denser. the cold pressing against the outer skin of the structure. Maio did something I want to describe carefully because I am not sure I can do it justice. She sat near the fire and she began to speak. Not to me, not to toss out, to the interior of the tipi, to the children, to the air. Her voice was low and continuous, and it had a quality, not quite singing, not quite recitation, something between memory and instruction. That made the children stop their movements and go still, not with fear but with the specific attention of children who know a story is being told. Tossout listened. He didn't translate immediately, he let her finish. She spoke for perhaps 20 minutes, then she was quiet. Then Tossout said, without looking at me, she tells them how the cold was survived before, how the people learned, names of the ones who taught them, what was lost and what was kept. She tells them so they remember. What was lost? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. People, the ones who didn't know yet, the ones who made mistakes before the knowledge was full. He paused. She tells the names of those too. I did not write in the log that night. I sat in the warmth of the structure and listened to a woman tell stories in a language I couldn't speak to children who would carry them forward, and I understood, in a way I hadn't understood before, that the knowledge keeping these people alive in -4 degrees F was not instinct. It was not primitive. It was accumulated testimony, passed from the mouths of people who had survived to the ears of people who needed to learn, across generations too long to count, in a process of education so sophisticated that it required no paper, no school, no formal institution. The cold outside was the same cold it had always been. The people inside knew its name. Log entry, night of day 3. Cold tonight, can feel it. The fire is the same size it has been for 3 days, no larger, no smaller. Mayo fed it twice in the last hour with pieces of dried wood about the length of my forearm. She has a pile of them, cut to the same length, which I didn't notice until tonight. They're not random pieces of gathered wood. They're prepared fuel, sized for this fire, this space, this temperature. She cut them, or someone did, before the winter, when there was time. I keep thinking about the almanac in Rutherford Oak's breast pocket. The almanac was wrong. These people have been right for longer than the almanac has existed. Fingers still present, all 10, writing this by firelight. The boy is asleep against my left side, which I didn't plan for, and I find I don't mind. Still alive. On the 4th morning, Ekapi spoke to me. Not to me directly, he addressed Tossout, who then addressed me, which was the correct protocol I would come to understand. I was a guest. I had not been introduced. I had been found unconscious and brought inside and fed and kept warm, but I had not been formally situated in the social architecture of the camp, and without that situation I was still something undefined, not enemy, not ally, not quite guest. A problem of categorization that had been gracefully deferred, while I was too frozen to constitute a category. What Ekapi communicated through Tossout was, if you are well enough, there are things you might benefit from understanding. This was not an invitation. It was not quite a command. It was something that existed in the space between, a statement of opportunity offered without pressure, which made it effectively more compelling than a direct order would have been. I said I was well enough. My ribs ached where I'd hit the ravine wall. My left knee had an opinion about cold that it was expressing continuously. But I could walk, and I will admit this, because the log requires honesty, desperate to be outside, not because I disliked the tipi, but because I was a man accustomed to open space, and 4 days of interior had produced in me a fidgeting restlessness that was difficult to conceal from people who noticed everything. Tossout, I think, had already told Ekapi about the fidgeting. The older man's expression, when I stood and took my coat from the peg it had been hung on, dried, repaired at the right shoulder seam with stitching that was neater than anything I could have done, held something that might have been amusement briefly, before the calm reasserted itself. The camp was larger than I'd imagined from the tipi's interior. 18 tipis, arranged in a loose arc along the windward side of the ridge. The placement was not casual. I could see this as soon as I stood outside and felt the wind. It came from the northwest, consistent, cutting, and the arc of the camp used the ridge to deflect the worst of it so that the interior of the arc was measurably calmer than the exposed terrain 40 feet away. The tipis were spaced evenly enough that they didn't block each other's smoke from rising, but close enough that their collective presence broke some of the wind's force. The doorways all faced east. I noted this in the log later. All doors face east, away from prevailing wind, toward morning sun. First warmth of day enters the interior when the cold is at its deepest, before sunrise heat when the night's cold has fully accumulated. Not spiritual, engineering, or both. Ekapi waited while I took this in. He didn't rush or prompt. He had the quality of a man who understands that comprehension cannot be accelerated, only enabled. Then he walked and I followed. What I was shown in the next 3 hours reshaped my understanding of what it meant to live in a place. We went first to the horse herd, smaller than I expected, perhaps 30 horses, gathered in a depression in the terrain that was not quite a valley but something more like a natural indentation in the hillside, which reduced wind exposure and also, I noticed, trapped some of the ambient warmth that radiated from the ground. The horses were moving slowly, grouped, occasionally pressing together in configurations that distributed body heat. They were not penned with fence, they were placed. The Comanche horsemanship I'd heard about was not just riding skill. It was the knowledge of horse behavior applied to winter management, knowing how and where horses naturally cluster for warmth, and using that knowledge to position them where the natural behavior would also keep them alive. A young man was with the horses, perhaps 16, 17. He acknowledged Ekapi with a brief nod and me with no expression at all, then returned his attention to the animals. He was moving slowly among them, checking feet, checking legs, running his hands along flanks. Not with the efficiency of inspection so much as the attention of relationship. He knew these horses individually, could read the difference between an animal that was cold and uncomfortable and one that was cold and in distress, and was acting on that reading in real time. I had wrangled horses for 11 years. I watched him for 10 minutes and learned 3 things I hadn't known. From the horses, we walked to what I can only describe as a winter cache, a set of underground storage structures at the base of the ridge's south-facing slope. The south face, Tassout explained, received direct sunlight during the shortest days of winter and stayed slightly warmer than the north-facing terrain. The storage pits were dug there, lined with bark and grass, sealed with hide, holding dried meat, dried plant material, rendered fat, and what appeared to be a supply of prepared fuel would cut to the same lengths I'd noticed in Mayo's tipi. The preparation for this winter had begun in summer. The food stores reflected decisions made 6 months earlier about how many people would winter here, what the caloric requirements would be, how much fuel would sustain how many fires for how many months. I kept thinking about the almanac. Rutherford Oakes' almanac was published in St. Louis and shipped to the territories and told you what the weather had done in previous years and what it probably would do based on that pattern. It was reactive knowledge, turned into prediction. What I was looking at was something different, proactive knowledge, turned into prepositioned resources. Not a prediction of what winter would do, but a preparation for what winter was. They didn't need to predict the cold. They had decided, long before winter arrived, that the cold was going to be exactly as cold as it had always been, and they had arranged their lives around that certainty. Tassout, watching me look at the cache, said, "What the summer gives, the winter needs. You can't fix winter in winter." He said it flatly, as if it were obvious, not as an insight but as a statement of basic fact that any adult should know. And it occurred to me that for a 12-year-old boy who had learned this at the age of 6 or 7, it was basic fact. The profundity was entirely on my side. We moved next to something I hadn't expected, and which I would spend the most time thinking about afterward. There was, at one end of the camp, a smaller structure, not a tipi, something lower, half buried, covered with a combination of hide and packed earth. A sweat lodge. It was not in use when we arrived, but Ekapi indicated it with a gesture that was different from the gestures he'd used at the horses and the cache, quieter, more deliberate. This was not engineering, or it was, but it was also something else. Tossout explained carefully. In the halting way he explained things he wasn't sure I had the context to understand. The sweat lodge was used not in opposition to the cold, but as a response to it. Not for hygiene primarily, though that was part of it, but as a controlled thermal experience. The extreme heat followed by cold air, or sometimes cold water, produced effects in the body that I had no framework for but which Tossout described in physical terms. It teaches the skin. The skin learns to hold warmth. The skin learns to open when the heat is too much and close when the cold comes. What he was describing, I would not have the vocabulary for it until years later, was something like cold adaptation, controlled thermal cycling that changed the body's response to temperature extremes. They were not just surviving the cold by insulating against it. They were training their bodies to work differently in it. "Does it hurt?" I asked. Tossout almost laughed. The first time. After that he searched for the word. Medicine feels like medicine, not always easy. Still medicine. I looked at Ekapi, who was watching me process this. He said something. Tossout translated. He says you would need a week before your skin could do this correctly. He says this is not an insult. He says a horse that has never run in cold cannot run in cold on the first day. It learns. A horse that has never run in cold cannot run in cold on the first day. It learns. The rest of the morning was harder to document because it was not a series of distinct observations, but a continuous immersion in the texture of how the camp operated in winter, and texture resists logging. I will try. People moved with a quality of economy that I want to call laziness, but is not. Every movement served a purpose. Unnecessary movement was not made. In cold weather, this is not comfort. It is survival mathematics. Every step you take in -4 degrees F costs you heat. Every moment you stand still, you lose heat to the air. The correct relationship between movement and stillness in extreme cold is something that every person in the camp had calibrated so precisely that watching them was like watching people who had been taught the exact minimum and the exact sufficient amount, and had found the balance point and lived there. Children played. I need to note this because it is easy to make this account sound like grim endurance. The children played. The girl who had been learning the needle lesson was outside for perhaps an hour in the late morning with 2 other children her age, playing something involving thrown sticks and markers pressed into the snow. They were dressed in layers, small versions of the adult dress, and they moved with the particular wild energy of children for whom being outside after 3 days of indoor storm was its own celebration. Their laughter was startling in the white stillness. Mayo sat outside her tipi for this hour, not watching the children exactly, but present in a way that meant she was aware of every movement they made without needing to look directly at them. She was working with her hands. Always her hands were working, doing something with hide that I couldn't see clearly. But when one of the children fell and didn't immediately get up, her eyes moved to the fallen child in less than a second, and she was on her feet before the child started crying, and she was already assessing the fall's seriousness before she reached the child, and the child was lifted and assessed and set right with the efficiency of someone who has responded to 1,000 small injuries and learned exactly what they require and nothing beyond what they require. No excessive alarm, no dismissiveness, exact appropriate response. I thought about the portion sizes. I thought about the fuel wood. Everything here was sized to fit. Nothing was in excess. Nothing was insufficient. They had found the right amount for everything and held it. We returned to the tipi in the early afternoon. My left knee had strong opinions about how long the walk had been, and I was colder than I expected. Or rather, I had lost more heat than I expected for the distance we'd covered, because I was not moving the way the people around me were moving, and my coat was good but my body was not calibrated. Ekapi watched me settle into the tipi, and then said something to Tossout that I didn't catch. Tossout came to sit near me and said, "He says you kept warm by moving fast. He says the people who survive winter don't move fast. They move right." "What's the difference?" Tossout thought. "Moving fast makes heat and then the heat leaves. Moving right makes heat that stays." He demonstrated, stood up and walked across the tipi in a way that looked almost slow, deliberate in the placement of each step. Weight shifted through the movement in a way that I couldn't immediately analyze but could see was different from how I walked. Then walked back in his normal way. "Which was which?" I asked. He pointed to the first. "Cold walk, heat stays in. The second, your walk, heat makes but leaves fast." I tried the cold walk. I felt ridiculous. He watched with the expression of someone witnessing a large animal try to do something small animals do easily. "Better," he said, which was clearly generous. "How long did it take you to learn?" He considered. "I don't remember learning. My mother walked this way. I walked with her," he paused, "since I could walk." The afternoon brought something I had not anticipated, a meeting. Not ceremonial, not formal exactly, but the adult men and women of the camp gathered in the largest tipi, belonging to a man I came to understand was something like the winter camp's organizing authority, though none of the words I had for that role quite fit, and there was discussion that lasted 2 hours. I was not invited. I stayed in Mario's tipi with Tossout and the children. Tossout told me what the meeting was about when it concluded, and he had received a summary from one of the women who had attended. The stores were calculated against the expected duration of the winter. They were sufficient. But the deer population in the immediate area had been lower than in previous years. Less snow in early season had changed the deer movement patterns, and the hunting would need to range further east than usual to supplement what was already cached. This meant longer trips in cold weather, more risk, more heat expenditure for the hunters. It meant adjusting the caloric allocation in the camp. The most physically demanding people would need more. The caloric reserves would be drawn slightly more quickly. The timeline assumptions would need to change. They had done this calculation together. All of them, including the women and the senior older people. The decision about how to respond, where to hunt, who would go, how the stores would be managed in the meantime, emerged from that collective calculation. No almanac. No Rutherford Oakes making the decision in his breast pocket. The knowledge distributed across every adult in the camp, pooled, and turned into a decision that the collective intelligence had produced. I wrote, "The knowledge is not held by one person, it's held by all of them. If one person dies, the camp loses a fraction. If all the old people die, they lose the archive. Malio's stories at night, that's the backup. The children are the backup." I thought about that for a long time. Night fell early, as it does at that latitude in January. Ekapi returned. The family settled into its evening arrangements. Meal, fire management, the small repairs and preparations that constituted the household's metabolism. Tossout before sleep showed me something in his knotted cord, a particular bead dark red, smaller than the others. "My grandmother," he said, "she knew more than Maio. Maio says this. She died in a sickness when I was small. I didn't learn from her directly. I learned from what Maio remembered of her." "Do you miss her?" He thought about this seriously. "I carry her, the cord. What Maio tells me, I didn't know her but I know what she knew." He looked at me. "Is that missing?" I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't. Log entry, night of day 5. Knee improving. ate the fat and dried meat preparation again. It is deeply unpleasant in flavor and deeply effective in function, which is a combination I have encountered in medicine and nowhere else. The cold tonight, significant. I can hear it against the tippy skin, a tightening sound, a contraction. The fire is the same size. The smoke hole is partially covered with a flap, first time I've seen it closed. Maio adjusted it twice in the past hour, watching the smoke. She is managing the air. The fire size, the smoke hole, the liner, it is all one system. She runs it the way a good engineer runs an engine. Continuous small adjustments, attention to feedback, no single dramatic intervention. I have been kept alive by knowledge I didn't know existed. I'm not sure how to feel about this. Grateful, obviously. But there's something else, something about what I didn't know, the most dangerous kind of ignorance. The kind you don't feel as ignorance. The kind that just feels like the way things are. Fingers all 10, getting warmer, writing this more easily than I have since I arrived. Tomorrow apparently we move. Tassau told me without much explanation, just, tomorrow we move. I did not ask why. I am beginning to understand that why is a question for people who haven't been paying attention. Moving camp in -4 degrees F is not a task. It is a performance of accumulated intelligence so complex and so practiced that watching it from the outside, I could not immediately identify the sequence of decisions being made. It looked like weather, like something that happened, not something that was done. But I was paying attention by then. I had 4 days of paying attention behind me, and I had learned to look at the thing beneath the surface of what I was seeing. The decision to move had come from the meeting, and from Ekapi's reading of the wind the previous night, and from something. I asked Tassau later and got an incomplete answer, possibly because the full answer involved knowledge categories that his English couldn't accommodate, related to the deer movement patterns, and the read of snow conditions, and the collective understanding of where shelter would be better for the stretch of deep cold that the sky's particular color apparently promised for the coming days. I didn't see the color signal. I looked at the sky when Tassau told me about it and saw gray-white, the same gray-white it had been for 5 days. He looked at it with me and said, "Different gray." I looked again. I could not find the difference. He looked at me with the measured patience of someone who has been asked to explain color to a person who can only see 2 of them. "You'll learn," he said, "or you won't, not cruelly, just accurately." The tippies came down faster than I would have believed possible if I hadn't watched it. 20 minutes per structure, approximately, from the first loosening of the stakes to the bundled poles and folded hides ready for loading. The system was, again, not a system I could extract and describe in sequence, because it was too thoroughly distributed. Different family members handled different elements simultaneously. Children carried objects too small for horses. The oldest woman in the camp, who I had seen only once before at a distance, and who moved with the careful deliberateness of someone managing significant pain in her joints, directed the bundling of her tippy's liner and hides from a seated position, pointing and commenting, while 2 younger women executed the physical work to her specifications. Her knowledge was separated from her body's capacity, and the camp had accommodated that separation so smoothly that she remained fully functional as an intelligence asset even as her physical participation declined. I helped where I could. Mostly I helped where I was put. Tassau positioned me at a horse and put a bundle in my arms and showed me how to secure it to the animal's side with a knot I had not encountered before, efficient, load-bearing, quick to release. I tied it badly the first time. Tassau retied it without comment. I tied it better the second time. He gave me a look that I logged as adequate. Maio was the last person I saw at the site where her tippy had stood. She walked the circle of bare ground once, the grass mat impression still visible, the fire pit's ash dusted with blown snow, and then she stood still for perhaps 15 seconds. I was watching from the back of a horse. She knew I was watching. I think she didn't mind. What she was doing in those 15 seconds, I could not say with certainty. Not prayer exactly, or not only prayer. It looked more like acknowledgement. The place had sheltered them. It had been part of the winter's survival. She was noting that before leaving it. Then she walked to her horse and mounted with the movement of someone who has done this 10,000 times and feels every one of them. And the camp moved. I rode with them. I had not decided to do this, or I had, in the moment Tossout handed me the horse's lead, and I hadn't analyzed the decision because analysis would have raised questions I didn't want to answer yet. My situation was, objectively, I was 40 miles from the nearest settlement, horseless, in January, in temperatures that were capable of killing an experienced man within hours of exposure. I was recovering from a near-fatal freeze. My company was either dead or scattered. Returning to the settlement required a horse, provisions, and knowledge of the terrain that I did not currently have. Staying with the camp was survival. This was the simple version. The complicated version, which I wrote down 3 weeks later when I had enough distance to be honest. I didn't want to leave. Not from fear of the alternative, though that was real, but because I was in the middle of learning something I couldn't name yet, and leaving would end the learning, and I was the kind of man, the log is evidence of this, who could not walk away from a thing I didn't yet understand. My father had called it stubbornness. My trail boss called it the best and worst thing about me. Tossout, who I would only tell about this motivation months later, called it hunger of the mind. He meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. The ride took most of the day. The terrain shifted. The ridge gave way to a broader plateau that offered less shelter but was crossed more quickly, and the pace of the column maintained the moving right quality I had been taught about, neither fast nor slow but continuously efficient, generating and retaining heat in a way that I tried to replicate and partially succeeded at. My left knee made its grievances known by midday and was ignored by midday, which is not wisdom but was pragmatism. Along the way I watched. Ekapi rode at the front and periodically stopped, read something in the ground or sky or wind, then redirected the column slightly. Never dramatically, always incrementally, adjustments so small that from the middle of the column they were only visible in retrospect, when you looked back at the track in the snow and saw that you'd curved without feeling the curve. He was reading the landscape in motion, not planning the route in advance, not following a fixed path, but responding to continuous information and making continuous adjustment. The route was not chosen before the journey. It was found during it. I wrote route not planned, read, like Mayo reading the smoke. Then I wrote, I have been trying to plan things for 29 years. I have been terrible at winter. The new site was chosen by Ekapi with what looked like minimal deliberation. He stopped, looked at a hillside, said something brief, and that was the decision. But I had learned enough by then to understand what I was looking at. Another sheltered arc, another south-facing cache site, terrain that would deflect the northwest wind in the direction the previous site had. He hadn't chosen randomly or quickly. He had known this place before we arrived. He had probably known 3 or 4 possible sites, and had been making the decision over the course of the ride based on what the weather was doing, and what the ground told him about snow depth and drainage and wind history. The selection felt instantaneous. The information behind it had been accumulating for years. Tippies went up faster than they came down. The same distributed system, reversed. Within 2 hours of stopping, the camp was sheltered, fires were lit, horses were positioned, and the older woman with painful joints was directing the interior arrangement of her family's tipi from the central position that let her see everything without having to move. Maio put wood on the fire, same lengths, same arrangement, and the tipi's internal temperature began to climb toward the specific, calibrated warmth that was neither too much nor too little for the space and the number of people in it. I sat down and realized my hands were shaking, not from cold, from something else. Tossout saw it. He didn't comment. He got the warm liquid and handed it to me. I drank it, the shaking stopped. That evening, something happened that I have thought about more than anything else from those days. Ekapi came to where I was sitting. By then I had a position in the tipi that was mine by unofficial assignment, slightly removed from the central family grouping but not excluded from it, and he sat across from me. He had an object in his hands, a small piece of worked bone, carved with marks that I could see were deliberate but couldn't read. He held it out. I took it carefully. It was smooth from handling, generations of handling, probably. The marks were worn at the edges, the carving's sharpness softened by time and touch. He said something. Tossout translated. He says this was his grandfather's. His grandfather made it during a bad winter when he was young. Made it to remember what that winter taught him. He says you have a log. He says the purpose is the same. I held the bone and looked at Ekapi. He was watching me with the calm that had characterized him from the first morning, not unreadable, just unhurried, patient. Why is he giving it to me? I asked Tossout. Tossout relayed the question. Ekapi responded. He says he isn't giving it to you, Tossout said. He says he's showing it to you. You can hold it, then you give it back. I held it for perhaps a minute, turned it in my hands, felt the weight of it, heavier than it looked, dense bone, the heft of something that had been meant to last. Then I gave it back. Ekapi took it and nodded once. He put it back in his clothing against his body. I don't know what I was supposed to understand from that exchange. I know what I did understand, that some knowledge is not given. It is shown, and the showing is enough if you are paying attention. I stayed 11 more days. In those 11 days, the cold deepened. There were 2 nights when Tossout told me the temperature dropped below what I had any reference point for much colder, he said, which in the context of the already extreme cold we'd been managing represented something I declined to quantify in the log because the number would have seemed impossible. The tipi held. The fire held. The camp held. The hunters ranged east and returned with deer. The portions were calculated and distributed. The children learned. The old woman with painful joints told Mayo something one afternoon that made Mayo laugh. A short, genuine laugh that I would not have expected from her, and which made her look 20 years younger. The boy who had been softening hide progressed to a larger piece and was clearly proud of this. The girl who had been learning the needle produced a finished object. I still don't know what it was, some garment piece, and held it up for Mayo's inspection. Mayo examined it, said something. The girl's expression went through a complex sequence. Initial anxiety, then careful attention to the assessment, then a specific kind of satisfaction that was not pride exactly, more like accuracy. She had done the thing right, and the rightness was what mattered, not the praise. I thought about how I had been praised my whole life for the wrong things. On the 14th day, Tossout found me and said that one of the hunters was going east in 2 days, and that east was in the direction of settlements, and that I could ride with him to a point from which I would be able to find my way to people who could help me get the rest of the distance. I said I understood. Then I sat with the log for an hour and tried to write what I had learned and couldn't. Not because I didn't know, I knew more than I could write quickly, but because the log's language was wrong for it. I wrote in a language that divided things into categories. This is a technique, this is a tradition, this is engineering, this is culture. But what I had witnessed for 2 weeks didn't divide that way. The fire was engineering and culture and family and memory and survival all at once, and the language kept trying to separate them, and the separation was a lie. I wrote, my categories are the problem. Then what they know whole. I keep trying to take it apart to understand it. Maybe it only works whole. The morning I left, Mayo did not say anything to me directly. She gave me something wrapped in a small piece of hide, knotted with sinew. She put it in my coat pocket, pressing it in with both hands once firmly, as if she were making sure it was real. I asked Tossout what it was. He asked her. She answered. She says it's fuel. For when your fire gets small. I didn't open it until I was back in the settlement, 3 days later, in a room with a stove and a glass window and a proper wooden door that kept the wind out completely. I opened it in warmth and safety and found a small piece of dried plant material I didn't recognize, a piece of rendered fat the size of my thumbnail, and a small river stone, smooth, dark, and warm from where it had been held. I looked at the stone for a long time. I put it on the windowsill where the thin January sun hit it. By midday it was warm. I went back to work for Rutherford Oakes for 6 more months. He never asked what happened during the 3 weeks I'd been missing. I think he assumed I'd found shelter somewhere sensible, a ranch house, a trading post, and rode out the storm. I didn't correct him. I kept the log. I still keep the log. 43 volumes now, the first 11 pages frozen and thawed and slightly illegible in the upper corners. I think about toss-out sometimes. I wonder what's on the cord now. I wonder how many beads. I wonder if he still touches the dark red one when he thinks of his grandmother. I think about Maio every winter when I build a fire. I think about the wood she cut to the same length before winter came. I think about what she said, that I was fighting the cold instead of using it. I'm still learning what that means. I think that's the point. Ekepi's bone carving is the thing I think about when I think about what was really being taught. Not the fire management, not the root finding, not the thermal physics of tippy design. The bone. The grandfather who made it in a bad winter. The marks worn smooth by 4 generations of handling. The fact that he showed it to me and took it back. The knowledge moves forward in people. Not in books, not in almanacs. In hands and voices and things passed down until the passing down itself becomes a kind of warmth. I lost 2 toes, eventually, to a different winter 3 years later, when I was more confident than I should have been and less careful than I'd been taught. I think about that too. I think you can know something and still fail to use it. That's not ignorance. That's a different problem. That's the problem of the self that thinks it already knows enough. The Comanche survived -4 degrees F without walls because they had decided, generations before I was born, that the cold was not the enemy. That survival was not about fighting what the world was, but about learning it so precisely that your body and your fire and your decisions and your stories and your children all fit inside it like the right-sized piece of wood in the right-sized fire.